It looks like something straight out of a nightmare, but it's not. It's real, and it claims that you don't have a soul. In 2010, a terrifying entity took a man named Dan Mitchell on a horrifying cosmic ride. This ancient entity shared with him the mystery behind the mysteries. And what Dan claims that he learned? Well, if it's true, then reality is much more terrifying than you could probably imagine. Dan's story began 30 years earlier in a quiet little town in the southeastern corner of Wisconsin. Something slithered out in the shadows just beyond his awareness, something that looked absolutely hideous, like a nightmare dressed in rags. At first, oddly, Dan thought that it was the Tooth Fairy, but it most certainly was not there for Dan's teeth. No, it was there for Dan, just 5 years old, and this thing had already zeroed in on him. And then it took him through decades of terror until it finally showed him the horrifying truth beyond reality. And that changed Dan's life forever. You know, after Amy did her research on this one, we weren't even sure that we were going to share this, because it truly is the type of story that, depending on what kind of mood you're in, absolutely could make you double check your locks and keep the lights on tonight.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
What would ultimately end with Dan being imparted all of the terrifying knowledge of reality oddly began here in this working-class neighborhood in the early 1980s on the south side of Milwaukee. The people in this neighborhood were tough, yet kind, and the streets often smelled like supper in the evenings. It was the kind of place where families played hymns, neighbors gathered in close quarters, and the faithful sang their praises all throughout the night. But behind the closed doors of one of these homes, behind the laughter and Sunday songs, something cosmic was brewing. Dan was 5 years old in 1981. He was the youngest of 3 boys, raised in what he described as a working poor, devoutly Christian household. His parents were strict. It was the kind of strictness that comes from fear of failure and sin. And his father was prone to anger. Whenever Dan disobeyed, or possibly even hesitated, well, discipline was often swift and harsh. And Dan had this soft, connective spirit, one that his father was determined to stomp out of him, to make him a man. Repeated scoldings drove Dan inward, and perhaps that is what opened the door.
When a child removes their mind from the outward world due to intense fear, they turn deeply inward, into the unseen domain.
It's unclear as to exactly what attracted the entity to Dan in the first place. He believed that his early introspection became kind of a key or a doorway into a deeper reality. Even as a small boy, he felt that something else was moving just beyond the edge of ordinary life. A quiet intelligence, waiting. And then, one night, it just made itself known. The first time that it arrived, it seemed familiar, even playful. It was late, and the house was quiet. So quiet, in fact, that little Dan could hear the hum of the refrigerator coming through the edges of his closed bedroom door before he fell asleep. And then, it was there. And it was odd, too, because it wasn't like it had come into his room, woke him up, and then began to communicate with him. No, strangely, Dan just found himself wide awake, already engaging with it, as if he had been up and doing so for hours. The entity, whatever it was, stood, or perhaps floated or glided in the center of the room, while Dan sat up in his bed.
In 1981, I began to experience visitations by an entity that would haunt me for years. It would often enter my room in the dead of night and communicate to me without words.
During those early visitations, Dan said that it never verbally spoke. Instead, it communicated through motion, kind of like a silent dance, a pantomime. Its body, long and flexible, moving with impossible grace. Its limbs bent in ways that would have shattered normal human bone. but each gesture carried a clear meaning, and Dan just intuitively, somehow, understood it.
It had an ancient appearance. Its skin was pale white, it sometimes appeared to be blue. On closer examination, skin had subtle cracks in it. Looked as if it were an old statue that had somehow come to life.
Early childhood memories fade over time. Dan remembered colors, mottled fabrics, and strange hats. The clothing was a patchwork of textures that he couldn't quite place in any era. It was familiar yet alien at the same time, as though it had been stitched together from cultures all throughout history. Its face was pale, almost white, like porcelain, yet it was alive. And its eyes, well, they were large and blue, and they seemed to look directly into Dan's soul.
The eyes moved like the eyes of a mime. They were overly expressive, as if to make up for the lack of verbal communication.
Dan said that its most memorable features were its hands. He said that they reminded him of his mother's hands. They were delicate, intelligent, and filled with quiet, loving authority. At the same time, though, he said that they seemed to hold a strange, ancient wisdom, as if they were the hands of a sage or someone of great knowledge. But it wasn't all wondrous and kind. No, its mouth was terrifying.
Its mouth was always open in the shape of an O, and it never moved, which made its face look like a living statue. And being open like that made it seem as if it were trapped in a perpetual state of shock, bewilderment, and horror.
Strangely, even with this horrifying expression on its face, Dan wasn't afraid. The entity seemed loving and connective. For years, he would call the thing the Tooth Fairy, but of course, it most certainly wasn't the Tooth Fairy. It was nothing like the stories that children are told. It didn't magically fly into the room and then exchange money for teeth. As a matter of fact, it never really entered the room at all. It was always simply just there, and then it was gone, leaving no trace, no sound, no transition. But over time, those visitations changed, and it began to adapt itself, as if it were purposely learning and then reflecting Dan's fears back at him. The presence that once felt maternal and loving became mocking, taunting, and dark. Eventually, Dan stopped seeing it as the Tooth Fairy, and he began to call it the Harlequin. Well, all of this just might have been chalked up to the imaginings of a child if Dan's father hadn't begun to sense it too. One night during dinner, the family heard footsteps upstairs in Dan's room. Then came laughter. It was loud, chaotic, inhuman, bone-chilling. Well, the family froze, including Dan's father. The man who never feared anything suddenly turned pale and silent. And then oddly, and this is creepy, as if he were in some strange horror movie, he too began laughing. But it wasn't normal. It was a forced, terrifying laughter. It sounded as if something had taken control of his person and was squeezing his diaphragm, making him laugh. He straightened up in his chair, and then he bellowed out. But then suddenly he just stopped, and then he held this somber expression on his face, as if he weren't quite himself. A second later, a glass tipped over, and then milk spilled all across the table, and it seemed to snap everyone out of it, back into reality. And oddly, everyone except for Dan acted as if nothing strange just happened, and Daddy hadn't laughed crazily. No one ever spoke of it again. As Dan grew older and began to see the broader picture of life, he started noticing patterns in his interactions with the Harlequin, and he came to believe that it wasn't just haunting him. No, it was trying to reveal some deeper secrets to existence. It began to draw him into a world of intuition and symbolism. It showed him glimpses of what might be thought of as the subtext of reality.
I was being shown how to understand the world, not through the five senses, but rather through a union of the senses and divine intuition.
These intuitive glimpses were not at all comforting. Just below the surface, reality began to feel apocalyptic, and these messages from this entity seemed extremely personal and strangely ancestral. Dan began to feel that the Harlequin hadn't just randomly chose him. No, it was somehow deeply connected to his family line. He later described it as a familial presence, one that carried his genetic memories. He believed that he was paying off some kind of a karmic debt. And these encounters, well, they weren't at all random. They were predetermined, and they seemed to be leading up to something profound. After a while, the visits stopped. The Harlequin moved to the shadows and began to stay out of sight, but it kept pushing deeper and deeper truths into Dan's mind. And when he was 9 years old, it started to show Dan that the three-dimensional physical world wasn't at all what it appears to be. It began in the summer of 1984. Dan was outside when this enormous object passed overhead, and it blocked out all of the sun's light. For a moment, day became night. Well, Dan looked around, and then he began to sense this overall feeling that reality was changing in front of him. He could feel it. And for a brief moment, he saw that the physical world was nothing more than a poorly designed costume that for some reason the rest of the world just kind of accepts as real. Then, in the winter of 1986, he saw something else. An old lady in his neighborhood had warned him about a truck, one painted in animal print. Supposedly, this truck was prowling the neighborhoods, snatching up children. Well, that winter, there was an accident, and traffic was rerouted down Dan's street, and he saw that truck. As it approached, he could see figures in the cab, and at first glance, they seemed to be normal, human, but they weren't. One appeared to be completely missing his lower jaw. Another's eyes were enormous and totally wrong. Dan said that their faces were just fragments, pieces that weren't at all in the right places. Eyes, teeth, hair, a horror show of almost human shapes staring back at him. Well, their misplaced eyes locked onto his, and as the truck slowly rolled by, Dan nearly froze, just stood there, watching it as it passed. And when their gazes finally broke, he turned and ran home. These strange glimpses into another world seemed to follow Dan everywhere. Once, as the family was heading toward their remote cabin in Eagle River, right around midnight, as they were making their way around a curve, the car's headlights fell across something strange. Now, mind you, it was pitch black out. There were no shops or homes anywhere for miles. But right there, on the side of the road, was a man pushing a stroller. As the car passed, this man didn't react, didn't look up, didn't really move. He just seemed to be completely unaffected, and he kept his face hidden in the shadows. The whole thing was just bizarre. By the time that Dan reached his teens, the Harlequin had faded into memory, replaced by nightmares and an unshakable sense that something was out there watching him. And of course, he became obsessed with questions about reality, religion, and the unseen. And if these were just imaginings of a child's mind, well, they somehow followed him into his adulthood. One night in the summer of 1993, when Dan was 18, he fell asleep listening to a cassette tape through his headphones. In the middle of the night, the tape stopped, but the sound continued. A voice began speaking. It sounded like a news report of some sort, but one that no radio station would ever broadcast. The man's tone was frantic, desperate. He claimed to be trapped underground, dying, deep inside of the earth. As the man talked, Dan couldn't move. And then the voice just grew more and more deranged.
The near-death experiences have started now. We are coming through the walls.
As Dan was listening to this, the voice expanded beyond the headphones and then filled the room, and then started to morph into something that wasn't quite human. It was too perfect, too mechanical, kind of like a machine that couldn't quite imitate human speech. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. and then there was just this deafening silence. Dan later said that it felt as if something had entered his mind and that he was being hacked by a presence that thrived on terror. 1 year later, in June of 1994, the Harlequin seemed to puppeteer, or maybe even possess, this random person. Dan had just left his high school graduation party. He and a group of friends were cruising down the street when they noticed a woman walking along the side of the road. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, puppet-like, as if her joints weren't connected correctly. As the car slowed, the woman turned her head to face them, and her eyes were wide and blue. And her mouth? Well, it was frozen in the shape of a perfect O. It was the same face that Dan had seen as a child. The Harlequin now was masquerading as a human woman. Someone in the back seat whispered, "Oh my God, the eyes." Another one said, "Look at that mouth." Well, panic set in. The car lurched forward and the tires squealed. The car took off and no one looked back. Strangely, in the years that followed, Dan's friends from that night suffered horrible fates. One of them died of cancer, and the others spiraled into addiction or prison. The Harlequin's message that night was clear: "I'm still here." As the years passed, Dan tried to live a normal life. He married, worked, wrote, but these cracks in reality persisted. Strange noises from nowhere, lights in the skies above his home, unexplainable shadows darting just at the edge of his vision. Well, by 2007, he had come to see these experiences as theatrical. The Harlequin, the lights, the voices, all of it. They were all part of some vast stage play that blurred the lines between inner vision and external reality. He started writing about it publicly in a blog called Luminosity. It gained a small but passionate following: abductees, mystics, and even people who claimed to be working for the government. They all said that they were reading his work. Well, Amy pulled up part of his blog, and at one point, Dan wrote that every time that he published something new, strange activity in his home would spike. He felt as though the act of writing itself somehow summoned the phenomenon, and he started to suspect that the Harlequin was not just a ghost or an alien, but it was something far older, much more complex, something that he would later call a cosmic adjuster, an amoral entity that enforces the very balance of reality itself. Well, he kept posting on his blog, and strange things kept happening, until one morning, not some woman possessed by the Harlequin, but the actual Harlequin itself knocked on the door. It was early morning 2009, and Dan was in the basement of a relative's house when all of a sudden he heard this violent pounding at the back door. Well, the sound was loud enough to shake the house, but no one else woke up, so he climbed the stairs slowly, listening to the repeated knocking, and with every step that he took, his heart rate increased. When he reached the top, he saw it. It was facing away from him, but it couldn't be anything else, right? It wore a patchwork of clothing from different eras, and its movements were jerky and disjointed. Still, he had to be sure, so he moved toward the door, keeping his eyes focused. And as he got closer, it began to walk away, kind of bouncing as it moved, a rhythm halfway between a human's gait and a puppet's dance. But was it the Harlequin? Well, just as that question was percolating to a boil, it turned back and looked at him, revealing that same statue-like profile: pale skin, fixed circle of a mouth, wide, unblinking eyes, and a moment later it disappeared behind the garage. Well, that moment, as brief as it was, sent him spiraling into dread. This was the first physical sighting that he had had of this thing in 15 years. It was back, and for a reason. Dan didn't know it, but he was about to graduate. Soon, he would be shown how all of this tied together and made up just a small sliver of a much larger cosmic play. Dan was about to be shown the mystery behind the mysteries. The following year, in 2010, Dan began having these very vivid dreams. Night after night, he would dream of this park. The sun was just coming up, and the Harlequin was there, waiting for him. In the dream, the Harlequin invited him to the park, and he said that if he'd come, he would show him the truth, and not just about the Harlequin, but about existence itself. Well, at first, Dan was reluctant, terrified really, but the dreams persisted. Eventually, in spite of his fear, he complied, but not without first taking precautions.
I wasn't sure what was going to happen, so I taped my driver's license to my leg just in case the Harlequin decided to kill me.
He drove to the park while the sky was still dark, and when he got there, he sat down on a bench and he waited. Before long, the sunlight began to peek over the horizon. The silence was heavy, and the air was motionless, and then came a sound, a crack of a branch. He turned, and in the dim lighting, he saw a tall, thin figure emerging from the trees. Its hair hung in strings, its clothing mismatched as though it had been sewn together from rags. Every cell in his body told him to run, but he had to know, what was this all about? So he turned back, he faced forward, and he listened. The figure stopped just behind him, and then came the voice. It's like a whisper that echoed just as much inside of his head as it did everywhere else.
Do you remember when we used to dance?
And in that instance, the world shattered. Dan described what followed as an explosion in his mind, a blinding cascade of imagery and sound that transported him beyond physical reality.
I saw an abyss without beginning or end. Inside were various energies made up of complex colors and textures, all flowing, interacting, and colliding together. These collisions and interactions were what formed physical reality as an after effect. Everything in the physical and spiritual worlds, from angels, gods, and demons, to galaxies and people, were nothing more than the mixing and exchanging of energies at this deeper level.
Dan learned that the concept of good and bad is a human creation, and there is no cosmic right or wrong.
Nothing was equal or fair. Tragedy and loss bestowed powerful meaning that could not exist if life was just an illusion, as many believe it to be. We had to embrace struggle, victory, and tragedy because they're a part of the energies that form us. When these energies no longer intersected due to a fading out of power or a collision by a different energy, the person simply dies. And this process was endless. Neither this abyss nor the energies within it were ever created. They've always existed.
Dan said that he learned that at this deepest level, there is no God. There's only beings who have learned how to steer their energies in such a fashion as to prolong their existence indefinitely. Many of them, he says, have interacted with humans for millennia.
There were many ancient gods, daemons, and cosmic beings who have guided life on Earth from behind the curtains for ages. Some of these entities were malefic and dangerous, while others were unassailable and unapproachable, burned with pure joy. I could feel laughter, howling, and rage all coming from different places in this boundless space.
Perhaps the scariest part of this whole thing was what Dan said he learned about the human soul. He said that by the nature of reality itself, there is no human soul.
In this abyss, nothing ever remained unchanged. The idea of a static, eternal soul, the sense of a fixed self, suddenly made no sense at all. Both the seen and unseen realms were too dynamic and alive to remain the same forever. There was only change, collision, and transformation.
Dan said that what scared him the most was that humans have much less control over their lives than they think they do.
Humans have such little control over their own lives, and few recognize it. One may wish, demand, and will for a particular outcome in their life. only to have everything shattered by a larger or more powerful current that casts one completely off their desired course.
In that abyss, Dan understood the Harlequin, not as a ghost or a demon, but rather a being that functioned between the seen and the unseen worlds. It had worn many faces across history: clown, jester, fool, even angel, but its function had never changed. It was here to reveal the unbearable truth of existence. Well, when the vision ended, Dan found himself running. He didn't remember standing up or leaving the bench, only that he was sprinting toward his car, gasping for breath. In his mind's eye, he could see the Harlequin chasing directly behind him, its movements distorted, its mouth fixed in that eternal state of surprise. Well, he drove home in a panic and then went straight upstairs to his computer, his blog Luminosity still open. Well, he began typing frantically, Latin phrases, cryptic sentences, warnings. Then he deleted it all. He swore that he would never again write about the Harlequin. But over time, that of course changed. Eventually, he stopped seeing the Harlequin as evil, and he began to see it as exactly what it claimed it was: amoral, neither benevolent nor malicious, something beyond human comprehension. It simply was, and there were others, like the Harlequin.
We are surrounded by life forms, gross and subtle, that will by necessity change us, grow us, and even kill us for their own growth and increase.
Today, Dan Mitchell lives quietly. His writings from Luminosity still circulate among researchers of high strangeness and the metaphysical phenomena. Some call him delusional. Others say that he's a prophet of the unseen. But perhaps he's neither. Maybe he's just a man who, for whatever reason, was shown the deeper secrets of reality. Or maybe he just had a very introspective life, brought about by childhood trauma from a dysfunctional home, and then over time he stitched together these deeper concepts that make us all ponder. And maybe the Harlequin, as Dan once suggested, is simply the face of reality, a mirror held up to the human mind, forcing us to see beyond the self. If that's true, well, then the Harlequin is not haunting Dan Mitchell. No, it's haunting all of us, and it forever wears that porcelain mask, part comedy, part horror, and it stands between the worlds, forever dancing in silence. Not angel, not demon, not alien. Something older, something that remembers who we were before we were born. And perhaps when the thin veil between the seen and the unseen flickers in the corner of a room or beneath the shadow of a streetlight, it still watches us, waiting for us to remember. Because, as the Harlequin once whispered in that quiet park in Milwaukee, "Do you remember when we used to dance?"
Oh, this one gave me the shivers. Imagining the Harlequin forever standing at the edge of eternity in a never-changing cosmic abyss. Is that what it's all about? Change? Like with the Pollock twins? If you've never heard the story, it's fascinating and creepy. John and Florence Pollock lost their two daughters when a depressed woman deliberately ran them over. And then John prayed that God would bring them back. And what happened next was either a miracle or something straight out of a Stephen King horror novel. We did a complete mystery on it. And if you'd like to see it, click up there.